Set, the Egyptian god of the storm, desert, chaos, and foreigner. Keep this description in mind as we go throughout this story. The relevance he has in the broader sense of the history of religion is hard to exaggerate. It's important to remember that the story of Exodus is not a Christian story. The story predates Christianity significantly. This is an ancient Jewish story, and the relevance of that will become apparent later on. But for now, let's analyze what this story says, the most common interpretations of it, and then we can talk more about the historicity of religion relating to the Exodus story. So, unlike many of the stories in the first book of the Bible, Genesis, the Exodus story is quite long. It's really one story that takes place throughout all 40 plus chapters of this book. So you really get to analyze details of it, where when you have a story like Cain and Abel, you can read it in a minute and a half, and you have to extract a lot of these interpretations from it. And you have to do that with this too, because this is still fictional literature, and pretty fantastical fictional literature at that. But it is true that this story is much longer and much more detailed. The story starts with explaining that the Egyptian pharaoh is afraid of the Jewish people. He orders all of the mothers of all of the female slaves he has, that if they give birth to a son, they are to kill the son, and they are only allowed to raise the women. And they did this because they didn't want any sort of violent rebellion. They didn't want the Jewish people to form a military with their young men. So they tried to enforce this law of only women were allowed to reach adulthood. There was a woman who broke this rule. She gave birth to a son, and instead of killing it, she made him an ark and put him in the small river nearby. And the pharaoh's daughter found this baby, and instead of killing it, she allowed the mother to raise it and allowed the child to reach adulthood. This sort of returns to the idea I discussed in the last episode, where the sort of Jordan Peterson type analysis of the Adam and Eve story indicates this sort of archetypal difference between male and female, where women tend to be more compassionate. They care more about people than men do, right? The general idea in like today's society is that men care more about things and women care more about people. That's why more men are engineers than women, and more women are teachers and nurses and therapists and things of that nature, right? You have this difference in temperament between men and women. And I don't think it's a coincidence that it's the Pharaoh's daughter who finds Moses, and it's the Pharaoh's daughter who allows Moses to live. I think this insistence on the Pharaoh's daughter finding Moses is sort of a callback to that idea, that it's trying to represent the difference in male and female temperament and how they approach things. If it would have been the Pharaoh's son who found Moses, chances are he would have been murdered in this story, or if the Pharaoh himself would have found him, and perhaps even Moses' mother would have been murdered. But since it was his daughter, she had a compassion for this child that a man may not have been able to have in the context of this story, and I don't think that's insignificant. Not long after Moses is grown, he actually commits murder. He murders an Egyptian person who killed one of his Hebrew brothers. And I think this indicates a couple of things. One, it is painting a clear picture that Moses is not a perfect person, and that's expanded on even further later in the story. But I think it's also indicating what the typical response to tyranny is with people. They rebel. They don't tend to roll over too easily. Most people might. We talked about the Nazi Germany and the USSR, and you had a lot of people rolling over, cooperating, and celebrating. But there were some people like Schindler who absolutely opposed it and stood up against this and saved a lot of lives. So you have this story representing a typical response to tyranny. And you saw the murder of Saddam Hussein, right? People rebel against tyrannical governments, and I think that's what this part of the story is trying to represent. That people do not like being tyrannized, and they will go to great lengths to avoid being tyrannized. And I think anti-tyranny is a core message of the entire book of Exodus. It is painting God as the spirit that opposes tyranny. No matter what conceptualization of God you use, whether it's this being in the sky as more modern typical Christians view it, or whether it's consciousness in that sort of agnostic way that a lot of people view it, it still fits. Like, if you are being tyrannized, you don't like it. Your entire body pushes back against it, whether it's minor tyranny or at full state level. And the entire book of Exodus is painting God as this being or idea or part of your consciousness that violently opposes tyranny, as we'll see later in the story. And if you're a God-fearing group of people, again, regardless of conceptualization, right? If you view your consciousness as God and you are not afraid of it, but you put respect on it and value what it tells you, then you will be even more opposed to tyranny, whether it's a being or consciousness. And I think that's why it focuses on this sort of being God's people that are opposing this, and that God is willing to violently free from tyranny. The next part of the story is one of the more famous parts, with the burning bush. God appears to Moses in a burning bush where the bush is unharmed. And I think the choosing of Moses is interesting. As I mentioned, he's not a perfect person, but nor is he a person of note. It's not like he came from royalty. He came from humble beginnings. He was found essentially orphaned in a boat on a river, and now he's being chosen by God to go free God's people. And the word Israelite, or Israel, literally means we who wrestle with God, and I don't think that literal translation is insignificant in this either, because it sort of gives the message that anyone who wrestles with God and tries to figure out what's going on with these God beliefs and stories is a part of God's community, and that he opposes the tyranny and slavery of that community. So I think this is a full anti-slavery story that's embedded very early in the Bible. I know there are some more pro-slavery verses later on, and we will eventually get to those and discuss them, but I think the overall principle with this story is that God is the spirit that opposes tyranny and slavery, particularly of the people who wrestle with him. I think the choosing of Moses also shows that it doesn't require a superhero to oppose tyranny or even ultimately destroy it. It just requires you being honest with yourself, understanding that you're being tyrannized, and willingly fighting it. So Moses asks God what to call him when talking to the Egyptian pharaohs, and God says to call him I am. And the direct translation of that is Yahweh. It's actually YH. I was listening to some linguistic podcasts about the Hebrew language, and apparently their use of consonants and vowels is not quite the same as it is with English and most modern languages. The vowels are sort of added in as little accent marks afterward, and the consonants do like the heavy lifting of the words. So this YHWH means Yahweh even though there's no A and E in it. I just found that interesting. And this Yahweh calling himself I am, to me that points to the idea that the Christian God, at least early on in these first few books, there was actually a bit of polytheism injected into these first few books, which is probably something I'll dedicate an entire podcast to. Regardless of that, I think this I am is sort of referring to the idea that this is just representing consciousness. Like, I am the thing that is making you want to do this, making you want to oppose tyranny. It's the part in you that wants everyone in Egypt or all of the Jewish people to oppose tyranny as well. Like, it's saying, I am. I exist because I am. And I think that is just a clear call to God representing consciousness. But there's another interesting part of Yahweh. It is not a Christian creation. It has a history. Now, it doesn't have a very deep history. However, what has been established is that it predates Christianity, and it was actually a storm god. And I think that's pretty potent, because rain kind of represents life, particularly in semi-arid areas like the Middle East, where a lot of these religions were created. So when a storm comes in and there's a lot of rain, plants grow, and it brings life to the area. And you also have to consider the fact that in the first book of the Bible, Yahweh destroys the entire earth with a storm, with a flood. So I don't think this history of Yahweh should be overlooked when we're talking about the Christian religion and Christian philosophy. It evolved from this storm god into this God of gods, King of kings that we see in the Bible. Regardless, this nondescript murderer, who actually even says he struggles to speak because he's nervous, which God or Yahweh responds with, I will speak through you, again indicating that Moses is not a superhero. He's not perfect. You don't need to be perfect or a superhero to oppose tyranny. Anyway, he is sent to Egypt, and Moses asks, what am I supposed to do to prove to them that I am a servant of you and that I'm working for you? And God tells him, and I think this is incredibly important, especially considering what we discussed in the episode on Friday, is that God said to throw your rod down and it will turn into a serpent. And I think that a serpent being the animal used to sort of be a tool of God's enforcement of freedom is extremely interesting. So we talked about that more like heretical interpretation of the Genesis story where the serpent represents this sort of spiritual and freedom of consciousness compared to this God who trapped us in a garden where we couldn't think about ourselves, we had no consciousness. The serpent told us to eat this fruit, and now we developed self-consciousness, and sure, it damned us to a few things like sacrifice and work and painful childbearing, but it was still an improvement according to most people, I would assume. Right? It's better to be conscious and be able to create things like literature and music and video games and movies and all these things that we know and love compared to just being another animal on the planet that's mindlessly going about its business. So, in the first two books of the Bible, there's a very reasonable interpretation for the serpent to be a representation of freedom and a representation of opposing the sort of tyranny. And there's a reason why Jesus compares his crucifixion to this event, to Moses throwing his staff down and it turning into a serpent, as we talked about in the first book. He said both of these things needed to happen, and they needed to happen like equally, like they were both equally important. So it's an incredible theologic premise here, in my opinion, that we're seeing the serpent come back again, and it's kind of the good guy again in this story. And you see, it was never associated with Satan until the book of Revelations, which again was like a much more recent addition. And I just think it is insane that the interpretation around the serpent in the Garden of Eden in the more traditional Christian sense is Satan, especially when you see this story in Exodus and it representing this enforcement of freedom in a sense. I think that something got mixed up along the way because I can't really wrap my mind around how the serpent is being associated with Satan in either of these early stories in which it has come up. But the story is pretty well known. You know, the Pharaoh doesn't let the Israelites go, so there's multiple plagues, frogs invade, the river turns to blood, Moses turns his staff into a serpent, etc., etc. And then the Passover happens, where the firstborn of the Egyptian Pharaoh is killed. And there's this harping of the firstborn again, which we discussed in the story of Cain and Abel. And that's sort of a constant throughout the biblical library, that the firstborn has a specific, inherent, and special value, which is why the Passover attacks the firstborn of this evil tyrant instead of any of its other children or its daughter that was there. So again, that's another interesting sort of callback to the book of Genesis. And you know, you would expect this with a philosophical set of texts, but there is something especially true about the Bible in that it references itself an extreme amount of times. Like, this is a picture sort of depicting the amount of internal references the Bible makes, and this is just a prime example of it here. So after the Passover, the Israelites are freed, but are they taken from this tyranny into the promised land with flowing milk and honey as this God promised? No, they weren't actually at all. They were taken into the desert until they were starving and on the brink of death and suffering for quite an extended period of time. And I think the message here is pretty clear that just because you overthrow tyranny and have moved past it does not mean your job is done. If anything, it means your job has just started, because you have to replace this tyranny with a rule of law or society that doesn't just recreate the tyranny. And something you see in this part of the story is that freedom itself, uninhibited and just pushed to its extremes, can be a form of tyranny in itself. And I think the drug addict is the perfect sort of like description of this in modern life. Is you have this person who is using their freedom to fuel their hedonism with drugs to the point where it becomes a harmful relationship, and they eventually become enslaved to their use of the drug. And as people who watch this podcast know, I'm a drug legalization advocate. But I'm well aware that there are these sort of people that exist where the freedom afforded to them becomes harmful and a form of tyranny in itself. And you see that in this story with the hedonists that begin worshiping the golden calf a little later on when Moses gets the Ten Commandments. But regardless, the point here is that once tyranny is overthrown, you're not done, and life can even probably get harder than it was before. You see this all over the world. When Saddam Hussein was killed, that part of the world didn't become peaceful and a beacon of hope. The opposite happened, and it still really hasn't fully stabilized. When the USSR fell, the Russian country did not, again, become like this beacon of hope. And same with Nazi Germany. You had serious economic and societal issues in all of these areas after these tyrants fell. And another thing that this story depicts really well is that at one point in the desert, they almost start wishing that they were back in control of the Egyptians, because they were saying things like, well, at least we had a full belly and there was bread and meat. And then, of course, you have the manna part of the story where bread and manna come flying out of the sky. But I wouldn't be surprised at all if this is also something that has occurred after these tyrannies and tyrants have been overthrown in more modern times. After Nazi Germany collapsed, their economy basically imploded. There was just sort of the reaction from the war and things of that nature, and then their government collapsed. And I'm sure there were some people saying, well, at least when Hitler was in power, I could afford bread, and I can't afford bread anymore. So this is one of the stories in the Bible that just sort of represent human behavior on a abstract but fundamental level. So this story of Exodus may not have literally happened, but it happens in sort of like a meta-truth sense, where anytime a tyranny is overthrown, you see these sort of patterns where perhaps the people are starving and they're dying and on the brink of death, but at least they're not being tyrannized anymore. And then they can eventually, hopefully, replace it with something that is more conducive of freedom and individualism. And I think that's a decent place to stop, because there's sort of a second half of this podcast that I want to get to that I find really interesting. And, I understand I didn't analyze the entire story of Exodus. It's a very long story. And one thing I kind of like about this system, I only did 2 stories in the book of Genesis. I only did the first third of Exodus here, is that if these videos continue to do well, the Genesis video is my second most viewed video I've released on this channel. If they continue to do well, then I can come back and do more of these stories in the future. So I'm going to keep going with this sort of system here. I pick out certain parts of the book that I find most interesting or profound and just build off of that, or 1 or 2 stories in particular. But I think I covered the most important ideas in Exodus, which are those key ideas I mentioned earlier, where you don't have to be a superhero to oppose tyranny and even defeat it. Once you're done opposing tyranny, that doesn't mean your job is complete. You still have to replace it with something that isn't tyrannical itself, and that may only be possible after a pretty long period of suffering. And God is the idea or part of your consciousness or spirit that opposes being tyrannized in the first place. I think that's the main messages that this entire book are trying to send, and I think you can sort of establish and cover those messages with the part of the story that I've covered here. So in the last episode, I had a decent amount of time focusing on Gnosticism, and I think that may also be a constant throughout this series. And it's just because I find the Gnostic tradition insanely interesting. It's a totally different and alien take on the Christian tradition than most people have ever been exposed to. Particularly growing up in Lutheran and Catholic schools, it's not something that ever came up. And the more I read about their tradition and the more I read about the history of that tradition, the more interested in it I become. So I covered the basics, and it's that the Gnostic tradition, there's a bunch of different branches of Gnosticism, but they all sort of have this similar idea in mind, and it's the creator of the universe called the Demiurge is an ignorant, egotistical, evil, lying god, and that he created humans to have worship slaves, essentially, and that the serpent represents our savior and what eventually led to the coming of Christ in the Garden of Eden. I covered all of that, but we need to discuss some things. So the first person to have an idea similar to this was actually Plato. He coined the word demiurge for the creator of the material world, but he didn't do so in a way to depict it as evil. He said that the matter that this demiurge had at its hands to create the material world was so flawed that even a perfect creator was incapable of creating a perfect world. And by the way, demiurge just means craftsman. It has no negative connotation. It's just a craftsman in Greek, I believe. Maybe different language, but that's the meaning of the word. And Plato's idea was just that he didn't have perfect materials, so he couldn't make a perfect product. So where did this idea of it being an evil being start to originate? Well, let's call back to the Egyptian god I mentioned at the very beginning of the episode. Because in Egyptian culture, the Jewish tradition was becoming more and more popular in that part of the world, and it was competing with the Egyptian religion. And the issue with that is that there is a key story in the Jewish tradition about Yahweh destroying Egyptian culture to free the slaves. And there was a sort of ideological war taking place in Egyptian culture and tradition when it came to the Jews and their Exodus story. So the explanation that they came up with was that, no, your God didn't save you. He made us expel you because he killed our firstborn. He kept giving us plagues. He turned our river into blood. He was destroying us, so we had to get rid of you. And your God didn't take you to the promised land. Your God took you into the desert until you starved to death. Right? So this is where that Set comes from, because Set is, well, Yahweh was associated with Set. Set predates Yahweh. But Yahweh and Set were associated due to this story. Again, Set is the god of the desert, the god of chaos, the god of the foreigner, the god of the storm. And it was Set that came in and destroyed Egyptian culture to free these people so he could take them into the desert where they would starve and die and suffer. And that is the first time this Yahweh is associated with a lying, malicious, manipulative, like killer being. And this was a really big deal. It's almost hard to exaggerate how big of a deal this was. So Set had something associated with him called Set's beast, which was mostly depicted as a donkey, but sometimes as something looking kind of like an ant eater. And when they associated Yahweh and Set, they started depicting Yahweh as a donkey, which is kind of like making a mockery out of this god. And this was such a prominent idea that the first or the oldest recorded artistic depiction of Jesus Christ is a half human, half donkey being crucified. Because the son of this donkey god is half human, half donkey, and the story around him is that he died a very embarrassing death, which is crucifixion. And again, this wasn't made by Christians, obviously. This was essentially graffiti mocking the Christian faith. So this was a very, very important change in this sort of history of religion. And it doesn't take much thinking or explaining to understand how we went from this sort of Yahweh being associated with this malicious god Set to this Gnostic tradition being added in and created later on, where the demiurge is this evil being and we had to be freed from it by the actions of the serpent. So the story doesn't just play an important role in the Christian and Jewish tradition, it's arguably the root of a lot of these heretical branches of this faith when it comes to Gnosticism, and it had a profound impact on Egyptian culture, which is why they had to come up with this little branch of mythology associating Yahweh with Set. And it's just incredible that this took place, because this is probably the root of Yahweh ever being associated with, or ever being considered an evil deity or evil being. And that led to one of the most popular heretical forms of Christianity ever, probably the most popular form of it, forming in later centuries. It was so popular, I said this in the last episode, that Valentinus almost became the Pope of Rome, and he was a very vocal Gnostic. So all of that started with this association the Egyptian tradition made between Yahweh and Set. And I just find that very interesting. So this story just played a significant role in the evolution of religious tradition. And I feel pretty happy about the analysis I gave for the first few chapters of the Exodus story, and I really wanted to cover that to start and then finish the episode with this really interesting history of religion bit. So I hope you enjoyed the episode, hope you learned something, leave comments, I'll respond to all of them, and we'll be back with another episode in the near future. Thank you.